My name is Emily, and until 3 years ago, I believed that some people simply pass through life unnoticed. I was one of them. I worked from home as a freelance book editor, lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Portland, and followed the same routine almost every day. I enjoyed peaceful mornings, long walks with a cup of coffee in my hand, and evenings spent reading by the window. My life was predictable, and I was perfectly comfortable with that. There was only one person on my street who never seemed to fit into the peaceful rhythm of the neighborhood. Her name was Margaret. She lived alone in the oldest house on the block, a weathered blue Victorian with a porch that leaned slightly to one side. The paint was peeling, the garden had long been taken over by wildflowers, and ivy climbed almost every wall. Children avoided walking past the house after sunset, and even adults rarely mentioned her unless someone new moved into the area. Nobody hated Margaret, they simply stayed away from her. Rumors had surrounded her for decades. Some people claimed she had once been wealthy and lost everything. Others believed she had no family at all. A few insisted that relatives had abandoned her years ago. Every version of the story sounded believable because nobody actually knew the truth. Oddly enough, I never found her frightening. Whenever I passed her house, I occasionally noticed her sitting quietly on the porch with a blanket over her knees, watching the birds in complete silence. Sometimes she would wave very slightly. I always waved back. That tiny exchange became part of my routine. We never spoke, not because we disliked each other. It simply never happened. Months passed that way. Then one rainy afternoon, I noticed her struggling to carry several grocery bags from the sidewalk to her front door. Without thinking, I crossed the street. I carried the bags inside, placed them on the kitchen table, smiled politely, and wished her a good afternoon. She thanked me with a gentle smile. That was all, or at least I thought it was. After that day, she occasionally left small gifts on my porch: fresh apples, homemade cookies, a tiny bouquet of flowers tied with blue ribbon. There was never a note. I accepted every gift with quiet gratitude. The neighbors began looking at me strangely. One woman even asked whether I was related to Margaret. I laughed and said no. She looked relieved for reasons I couldn't understand. As time passed, I realized something unusual. Margaret always seemed to know exactly when I was having a difficult day. Whenever work became overwhelming or I felt lonely, another small gift would appear outside my door. It felt impossible. I never told anyone when I struggled. Still, somehow she knew. I started wondering whether she simply understood people better than everyone else. Winter arrived, snow covered the neighborhood, and I saw Margaret less often. One morning, I noticed newspapers piling up near her front steps. The porch light remained on all day. Her curtains stayed closed. Something felt wrong. I called the local authorities to request a welfare check. That single phone call changed everything. Margaret had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. People spoke about her for 2 or 3 days before returning to their normal lives. I attended her small funeral. There were only 6 people: the pastor, 2 employees from the funeral home, an elderly woman from another town, a man who introduced himself as Margaret's attorney, and me. I remember feeling strangely emotional for someone I barely knew. Perhaps loneliness recognizes loneliness. After the service ended, everyone prepared to leave. The attorney approached me. He asked if my name was Emily Carter. I confirmed it. His expression immediately softened. He reached into his leather briefcase and handed me a sealed envelope. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were 5 simple words: for Emily. Open after goodbye. I stared at the envelope for several long seconds. The attorney quietly explained that Margaret had left detailed instructions. The envelope belonged only to me. Nothing inside surprised him anymore. Apparently, she had prepared everything months before her death. When I finally opened it later that evening, my hands were trembling. Inside was a handwritten letter. The first sentence made absolutely no sense. If you are reading this, Then I ran out of time before I could tell you who you really are. I read the sentence again, then again. My heartbeat became louder with every word. The rest of the letter only deepened the mystery. Margaret apologized for remaining silent all those years. She wrote that she had promised someone she would never interfere unless it became absolutely necessary. She also explained that everything she owned now belonged to me. Not only the house, everything inside it, every photograph, every journal, every locked drawer, every secret. The final paragraph was even stranger. Do not sell the house until you discover why it was always meant to become yours. I barely slept that night. I had no idea why a woman I barely knew had trusted me with her entire life, but deep inside, I already knew one thing: the answers weren't inside the letter, they were waiting for me inside her house. The next morning, I stood in front of Margaret's house holding the old brass key the attorney had given me. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had, yet everything felt different. The house no longer belonged to the mysterious woman everyone avoided. It belonged to me. Unlocking the front door felt strangely emotional. The familiar scent of old books, cedar wood, and dried flowers filled the air. Sunlight slipped through lace curtains, making tiny dust particles sparkle in the silence. Nothing looked abandoned. It looked as though Margaret had simply stepped outside for a walk and would return at any moment. I spent the first hour walking slowly through every room. Everything was organized with incredible care. Every shelf was dusted, every photograph stood perfectly straight, every book had been placed with intention. It didn't feel like the home of someone waiting for the end of life. It felt like the home of someone preparing another person to begin a new one. In the living room, I found dozens of framed photographs. Most showed landscapes, old neighborhoods, and ordinary moments from decades ago, but one picture made me stop. It showed a little girl sitting on a wooden swing. She couldn't have been older than 5. Her face wasn't completely visible because she was looking away from the camera. Still, the sweater she wore looked painfully familiar, blue with tiny white stars. I suddenly remembered a faded childhood photograph my mother had kept for years. I had been wearing the exact same sweater. The memory hit me so unexpectedly that I had to sit down. It was probably a coincidence. Children own similar clothes all the time. That explanation sounded reasonable, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen this photograph before. I carefully turned the frame over. Written on the back were 6 words. She always loved the swing. No name. No date, just those words. The rest of the day became a slow search. Through the house, Margaret had labeled nearly every drawer, kitchen, letters, bills, recipes, garden. Nothing unusual until I reached the attic. The attic door resisted at first before opening with a long creak. Unlike the rest of the house, this room was filled with old trunks, wooden boxes, and shelves covered with carefully stacked journals. Each journal had a single year written on its spine. The collection continued year after year. More than 40 journals. My hands hesitated before choosing one. The first pages contained ordinary observations, weather, books she had read, birds that visited the garden, neighbors moving in. Nothing extraordinary. Then I reached an entry dated 28 years earlier. Today I saw her again. She is growing so quickly. I wanted to tell her everything, but I made a promise I cannot break. My heart skipped. There was no name, only the word her. I kept reading. She smiled today without knowing who I am. Perhaps that is better. Children deserve peaceful lives, not complicated truths. The words unsettled me. Was she writing about me? Or someone else? Hours passed as I searched through more journals. Every few years another similar entry appeared, always mentioning her, always describing birthdays, school graduations, moving to another apartment, starting college, beginning a career. Every milestone sounded frighteningly similar to my own life, but Margaret never described Speaking to that person, only watching from a distance, I closed the journal. A strange thought entered my mind. What if I wasn't reading about a stranger? What if I was reading about myself? I immediately rejected the idea. It sounded impossible. Margaret barely knew me. At least that was what I had believed. Late in the afternoon, I discovered a small locked wooden chest beneath an old quilt. Unlike everything else in the house, it carried no label. The key wasn't anywhere nearby. Inside one of the drawers, however, I found another envelope. Across the front, Margaret had written only one sentence: open this only after you begin asking the right questions. I laughed quietly. I was already asking hundreds of questions. Inside the envelope was a tiny brass key and a folded sheet of paper. The note read, "The truth begins in the basement." I had completely forgotten the house even had a basement. The stairs leading down were narrow and dimly lit. When I reached the bottom, I found shelves filled with neatly labeled boxes. Again, everything had been organized with extraordinary care. Most boxes contained tax documents, old furniture records, and family keepsakes. Then, I noticed one box without a label. Inside were newspaper clippings. Every article featured the same story: a devastating highway accident. Nearly 30 years ago, one family survived, another did not. The articles mentioned a little girl who had been rescued from the wreckage. For privacy reasons, newspapers never printed her name. The date caught my attention immediately. It matched the year my parents had once told me we moved to another state. I frowned. That wasn't possible. According to my parents, we had moved because my father received a better job offer. Nothing about an accident had ever been mentioned. Beneath the newspaper articles lay a hospital bracelet. The plastic had yellowed with age. I picked it up carefully. My breath caught in my throat. The first name printed on it was unmistakable: Emily, my own first name. The last name was faded beyond recognition. I stood frozen. Coincidences had carried me this far. Now, they were beginning to disappear. Suddenly, I noticed something taped to the bottom of the box. Another handwritten message: if you have reached this point, you are finally ready to learn why everyone believed I lived alone. For several seconds, I simply stared at those words. Then I looked around the silent basement. For the first time since entering the house, I no longer felt like a visitor. I felt like someone who had unknowingly returned to a place that had been waiting for her all along. I still didn't know who Margaret truly was, but I was beginning to understand one terrifying possibility. She hadn't left me her home because I was kind to her. She had left it to me because somehow it had always been mine. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying every discovery in my mind: the journals, the hospital bracelet, the newspaper articles, and Margaret's notes. None of it made sense on its own, but together they pointed toward a truth I had never imagined. The next morning, I returned to the attic with one goal: find the final piece of the story. There was only one trunk I hadn't opened. Unlike the others, it was painted white and carefully polished. The small brass key Margaret had left fit the lock perfectly. Inside were only 3 things: a photo album, a bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon, and one sealed envelope with my name written across the front. I opened the album first. The first pages showed a young woman smiling beside a newborn baby. The woman looked unmistakably like a younger Margaret. Her eyes, her smile, even the small scar near her eyebrow matched the photographs downstairs. I turned another page. There she was again, holding the same little girl as she learned to walk. Another page showed birthday decorations. Another showed Christmas morning. The little girl grew older with every photograph. Then I reached a picture that stole the air from my lungs. The child was wearing the blue sweater with tiny white stars. This time, the girl's face was clearly visible. It was me. I couldn't deny it anymore. The same eyes, the same smile, the tiny birthmark. Near my left wrist, I had seen those childhood pictures in my parents' photo albums. My entire life, except these photographs, had been taken by someone else, someone who had been there before those memories ever reached me. My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope. Inside was Margaret's final letter. She explained everything. 30 years earlier, she had become my legal guardian after my biological parents died in the highway accident I had read about. She loved me deeply, but only a few months later she was diagnosed with a serious illness. Doctors believed she would not live long enough to raise a child, wanting me to have a stable future. She made the most painful decision of her life. She allowed a close family friend, a loving couple unable to have children, to adopt me. They promised her one thing: they would give me a happy childhood. In return, Margaret promised she would never interfere, she would never appear unexpectedly, she would never reveal the truth while my adoptive parents were alive. She would simply watch from a distance and make sure I was safe. That promise became the center of her entire life. She moved to the same town years later without telling anyone who she truly was. She watched me grow. She attended my school concerts from the last row. She quietly celebrated every graduation. She smiled every time she saw me walking through the neighborhood without ever expecting me to recognize her. The gifts she left on my porch had never been random. They appeared on days that reminded her of important moments from my childhood. The apples were my favorite fruit when I was little. The homemade cookies followed my birthday every year. The flowers matched the ones that grew beside the house where I was born. Tears rolled down my face, not because I felt betrayed, because I suddenly understood the depth of a love that had asked for nothing in return. Margaret had spent decades protecting my happiness while accepting that I might never know who she was. Near the end of the letter, she wrote something I will never forget: love is not measured by how tightly we hold someone. Sometimes it is measured by the sacrifices we quietly make so they can build a beautiful life without carrying our pain. I read that sentence over and over. For the first time, every strange moment suddenly made sense. The gentle waves from her porch, the quiet smiles, the gifts, the feeling that she somehow knew when I needed kindness. She hadn't been watching a neighbor, she had been watching the little girl she once believed she would raise. There was one final surprise. Attached to the letter was a legal document. Margaret had established a small charitable foundation using most of her savings. Its purpose was simple: to help children who had lost their parents find stable, loving homes. She hadn't wanted the money to remain locked inside a bank account. She wanted it to become hope for someone else. She had asked me to oversee the foundation if I felt ready. I accepted without hesitation. Selling the house was no longer an option. It wasn't just a building. It was the only place where every hidden chapter of my life had quietly waited for me. Over the following months, I restored the old Victorian home. Instead of replacing it, the peeling paint disappeared. The porch became strong again. The wild garden bloomed with new flowers while keeping many of Margaret's original plants. Neighbors slowly began stopping by. Some admitted they had always misunderstood her. Others confessed they regretted never speaking to her. I never blamed them. They had only seen an elderly woman living alone. I knew they had actually been looking at someone who had carried extraordinary love in complete silence. One afternoon, while organizing the final shelf in the attic, I discovered a tiny notebook I had somehow missed. It contained only one unfinished sentence: if Emily ever smiles inside this house. The page ended there. She had never finished writing it. I smiled anyway. Then I placed the notebook beside her favorite chair in the living room. Sometimes I still sit on that porch in the evenings. Children ride their bicycles past the house. Neighbors wave, birds gather in the garden exactly as they always did. Every now and then, someone asks why I never moved away after inheriting such valuable property. I simply smile, because some homes are worth more than money. They hold the truth about who we are. Margaret never wanted to be remembered as the lonely woman everyone avoided. She wanted to be remembered as someone whose love quietly changed a life. And every morning, when I unlocked the front door, I remember that the greatest inheritance she left me was never the house. It was the certainty that even the quietest acts of love can echo across an entire lifetime.